Today we are going to be revisiting the shipping and immigration records in the New South Wales State Archive collection and how we might locate the arrival of an individual into New South Wales. Firstly though, I will begin with an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, New South Wales State Archives acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. To begin with, I'll just give you an outline of the records that we will be looking at. First, we'll look at the convict records as the first arrivals and of course their families who came out to join them. Then we'll look at the free arrivals, assisted immigrants and unassisted immigrants, look at records relating to crew arrivals, militaries, and of course, departures. Just some general tips to start with. We always recommend that you check a death certificate. In New South Wales, death certificates can show the number of years a person spent in the colony. So if you're not sure of when your ancestor might have arrived, it might be worthwhile getting the death certificate as it may state 20 years in New South Wales, and that's going to give you a time frame to look at. Also, check available indexes and records. With the indexes, not just traditional indexes, but also you can often pick up a reference to when someone arrived in the colony in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence, and we'll look at some examples of that. In some cases, there are two records for the arrival of a vessel into New South Wales, and one may provide more information than the other, so it's always good to look at all the records that are available for a particular event. Also, consider spelling variations of names. Often it becomes something quite simple, like for instance, Nagle, N-A-G-L-E, could appear in an index as N-A-G-E-L. So it's always wise, if you're having trouble, play around with how that name might have had different spellings over the time. And of course, after 1922, passenger arrivals into New South Wales are held by the National Archives of Australia when immigration became a federal responsibility. Now starting with convicts, convict arrivals can be located through indexes to the convict indents and other records relating to their time as a convict, something like ticket of leave, conditional pardons. We always suggest that you look at the convict guide for more information as at a broad overview of all the records we hold relating to convicts. How might you find these guides and indexes? Well, on our homepage, there are many ways you can do this. Under quick links, there's online indexes, which are alphabetical, A to Z, so you would go to C for convict, and then the research guides, which are also in alphabetical order. Scrolling down the page, you can see we have another link to indexes, but also we've grouped some of the most popular research topics in a little spot down there. So you can see we have convicts and just beside it, shipping and immigration. So if I were to click on that convict link, it would take me to this page, which details all our resources, indexes and guides relating to convicts. If you just wanted the convict indexes, you would go to the online indexes and then C for convicts. So as you can see, we've got the convict index 1791 to 1873, the early convict index, and the images have also been digitised on our website from 1788 to 1801, and we'll see an example of that shortly. And there you see I've got circled the Convict Administration Guide. Now previously this had only been available in hard copy to look at our reading room, or perhaps you could purchase a copy. But now, through the wonders of technology, you can actually browse this guide on our website. So just by clicking that little grey tab there, that's going to page you through the convict guide. Looking at the table of contents, you can see that it's all grouped into subjects. So all the records relating to trial and transportation will be there. All the records relating to pardons, tickets of leave, all have their separate little chapter. So very easy to look at and find the records that you might be trying to research. The indexes we have available for convicts, the main one is the Index to Convict Indents to New South Wales, 1788 to 1842. Now that was published by the Genealogical Society of Victoria. So that's available on microfiche in our reading room. The indexes we have on our website are the Convict Indents, 1788 to 1801. And as I mentioned, these have been indexed and the images digitised and available on the website. The big index is the Convict Index 1791 to 1873. That's a single searchable database containing indexes to certificate of freedoms, tickets of leave, convicts' deaths, but it doesn't include the indents. So the index to the indents is not included in that particular index. Then there are a few other little indexes there. Index to Colonial Secretaries Papers, 1788 to 1825. The exciting news about this is this now has been, the images have been digitised and you can access the images from the index entry, and we'll look at how you can do that. Now, this is a wonderful resource for early convicts and also early free settlers. Following on from that is the Joan Rees Index to Colonial Secretaries in Letters, 1826 to 1896. Now, this is available in our reading room and the New South Wales State Library. As many of you would know, many of our convict records have been indexed and digitised on Ancestry. Now, although Ancestry is a subscription fee-based service, it is available to look at free in our reading room, the New South Wales State Library, and many of the local libraries around Australia. So it might be good to check with your local library to see if they do provide free access to Ancestry. Now, looking at the early indents and what type of information you might see about a convict on those indents, we'll look at the early one, the convict indents on our website, 1788 to 1801. So under indexes, you will find that. So then to search the index, I'm going to look for Mary Gorman, who has arrived on the Albemarle. So click on the details tab there, and that'll take you to a page that gives a little bit more information. And then to see the image, just click on the image gallery there. I've got it circled, and that will take you to the digital image of that indent. Now, early indents don't provide a lot of information about the convict, just the basic information. So there we have Mary Gorman. We have where she was tried, which was Justice Hall, Old Bailey in Middlesex. The date of her trial, 16th of February, 1791, and her sentence, which was 7 years. So just the bare minimum about the early convicts on their indent. However, over time, the amount of information recorded about a convict on an indent became quite a lot, you would say. So looking at this one from 1834, this is the convict indent for the Hive. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of detail provided about each convict. So we have their name there, we get their age, their education, whether they could read or write, their religion, married or single, if they have any family, so that would indicate children, their native place, trade or calling, the offence, where tried, when tried, their sentence, also any former convictions they might have had. And then we get a written physical description of the convict, so the height, his complexion, whether it was pale or ruddy, and then the colour of his hair and his eyes. So from that, you could actually probably get an image of what that convict might have looked like. Often, sometimes they had how they were disposed of, who they were assigned to, and also just in their name column, you might get references to a ticket of leave or a conditional pardon. So this information, there's a lot of detail about the convict on this particular, on the later indents, as we see. So many of these convicts left families back in England when they were transported out to New South Wales. So over time, some of these families joined their convict husbands or fathers, or even children joined their mothers. Once a convict had a ticket of leave, that's when they could apply to have their family brought out at the expense of the Crown. But they had to be able to show that they could support their family and they weren't going to be a burden on the government when they came out. So the applications that the convicts did to have their families brought out at the Crown's expense can be found in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. Convict children could often accompany a convict parent out, usually the mother, on the voyage, but they're often not recorded by name. It might just have listed two on board. Going back to the convict guide, there's an actual chapter on families of convicts. So that will detail the records in our collection relating to the arrival of convict families into New South Wales. So the one that we're going to have a look at is Musters and Other Papers relating to the convict ships 1790 to 1849. Now these records came from England on the convict vessel and generally relate to the convicts on board. But as the name suggests, there can be sometimes other papers. And these other papers can include papers about the families of convicts on that vessel. On our website, we have an alphabetical list of the musters and other papers. So you can see you get the real number, the original location, and the page number, and it'll also indicate if there are any other papers included on that particular voyage. So we'll have a look at the Surrey in 1833. So we can see there, as well as receipts for convicts and remarks on the behaviour of all convicts, there is also a list of children allowed to accompany their mother and papers, families of convicts in New South Wales. So looking at that, you can see the correspondence here. So the first one on the left-hand side was actually written from Dublin Castle to the Governor of New South Wales. And it states, I am commanded by the Lord Lieutenant to send you the enclosed list of wives and children of convicts in New South Wales who have been embarked on board the ship Surrey, who have been recommended for a free passage to that colony. And as you can see, enclosed is the list of the families, the name of the wife, and then the children, including their age. So quite a handy little record there. And just as a bonus, there is another record attached to this, and this is from the master of the vessel, acknowledging that he has received on board 17 women and 38 children, wives and children of convicts in New South Wales who have permission to proceed to that colony. And we also get a list of the clothing that they brought with them, but also the clothing that they were issued. So petticoats, stocking, trousers, vest, caps, handkerchiefs. So that's just a little additional record that you get to see about that family of convicts coming out to New South Wales. Now, children of convicts, as I mentioned, particularly young children, could often accompany their convict mother out on the voyage, but not recorded by name. So if we look at this example of Anne Maria Martin coming out on the Lucy Davidson in 1829, we can see there that under family, it just lists 2 on board, no other information. Now, there were no other papers for this vessel. However, another place you could look is the Colonial Secretary's papers. So checking the Joan Rees Index from 1826 to 1896, there is an entry for Anne Martin, and we know it's her because the ship she came out on is the Lucy Davidson. Now, what this gives you is the letter number, so 28/978, 29/9788. So 29 being the year 1829. You'll also get the box number that letter will be in. Now, unlike the 1788 and 1825 correspondence, this hasn't been indexed, so most of these records are still original. Some have been copied onto reel, and that will be noted, as you can see on those other entries. Now, these are available to access in our reading room. So looking at what that letter is, and it is indeed about the children that came out on that convict ship. So this is sent from the female factory, and it said, we have the honour to provide a list of the children of female prisoners who arrived by the convict ship Lucy Davidson and beg to request that orders may be obtained for their reception into the King's Orphan School. So that was the other thing. The children that did come out with their convict mothers were usually put into orphanages when they arrived. But with this particular record, we get a list of the children. So we can see there, just with the red arrows, a William Martin and a Sarah Martin. We get when they were born, so their date of birth, where they were baptised. But we also, in the end column, get their name of their father, John Martin, who's a blacksmith in London. So starting off with only being 2 on board, we do, in the end, get a lot of information about Anne Maria's children coming out to New South Wales. Now, the applications that the convicts would write to have their families brought out at the Crown's expense can be found in the Colonial Secretary's indexes. So looking at the early index, 1788 to 1824, this is what we'd see. So we'll look at James Dennis. Now, he has a few letters there, but we'll look at the one on the 10th of July, and that's the petition to have his wife, Elizabeth, and children sent out at government expense. And then there's one down there on the 22nd of July 1824 regarding his family's passage to New South Wales. So again, if we click on details, take us to that page, and then we will go to the correspondence. So James's petition is on the right there, and he's saying that he's a prisoner for life, and he arrived on the General Stewart in 1818. and that Your Excellency's petitioner has left a wife and 7 children now residing in the county of Devon who are waiting to rejoin the petitioner. And he states that he is able to support his family and he hopes that this application will be looked on favourably. And you can see there we have his wife's name and his children's name and their ages. Now, accompanying his petition is a letter from his employer, Hamilton Hume, and he states that James has been in his employ upwards of 6 years and that he has conducted himself as a sober, honest, and industrious man and is capable of supporting his family, and that he has a piece of land under cultivation which he had given to him for his good conduct, including 5 head of cattle. So a very good supporting letter for that. So based on all of that, I'm pleased to say that James's application was approved and his memorial having been submitted to the governor and free passage to the colony will be solicited for his family. Now, as it is a very early time period, we couldn't find a record of his family coming into New South Wales, but I think we can assume that they did make their way out here. Now, looking at a later application, this is in 1848, and this is by a former convict, Patrick Spearin. Now, he's petitioning for his wife and son to be brought out at the Crown's expense. So you can see it's a little bit more formal. There's a form that he filled out. And on that, he's saying he is a tailor of his own account at Clarence Street in Sydney. So he provides his wife's name, including her maiden name, her current residence, and also his son's name and his son's age. And then just at the bottom, again, persons to whom the applicant are known are vouching for his good character, and this includes the Archbishop of Sydney. So Patrick Spearin must have been a very well conducted man to have such illustrious people saying that he was a good man. So again, you can see, and this time we've looked at the Joan Rees Index to get a reference to that petition. Now, I'm pleased to say, unlike the Dennis family, we did locate the arrival of Patrick's wife and son. They actually arrived on an assisted immigrant ship in 1850, so 2 years after Patrick had put in the application. So you can see on the ship there's a group, wives and families of convicts, and then down the bottom we have Ellen Spearin and John, the son, coming out. We get their calling, their native place. We also on this one get Ellen's parents, which is a bit of additional information, and then relations in the colony, which of course is Patrick. Now, just as a little side note to this, Patrick arrived as a convict in New South Wales in 1831, so he isn't reunited with his family until 1850. So if you think about it, his son would have been 1 or 2 years old when he last saw him. So yes, it would have been quite a good reunion. Now, because they have come on an assisted immigrant ship, they also appear in our Index to Assisted Immigrants, 1839 to 1896. So you can see John and Ellen Spearin there on the Assisted Immigrant Index. So that's a nice little lead into our next topic, which is free arrivals. So free arrivals are divided into those who are assisted. So these are people who had their passage paid for them through one of the many schemes that operated in New South Wales or the UK at that time. Now, records of assisted passengers contain quite detailed information about an individual. The government wanted to know if they were going to be able to work and support themselves. So they wanted to know if they were strong and in good health, and they weren't going to be a burden on the government if they had their passage paid out. Unassisted passengers, they're people who paid their own fare. Now, you might find in some cases that one family member paid their own way out and then sponsored other family members to come out. However, because they've paid their own way out, the level of detail about an individual is not the same as those who are assisted. In most cases, you're only going to get a name, and sometimes it might just be Mr. and Mrs. Smith and 5 children. So it can make it difficult to identify a person on an unassisted passenger as the person that you're researching. Most of the arrivals in the New South Wales Government archives relate to arrivals in Sydney. We do have arrivals into Newcastle up to 1860, and of course for the assisted immigrants we've got Moreton Bay 1848 to 59 and Port Phillip 1839 to 51 before they separated. So as with the convicts, you can access the guides and indexes from our homepage, the immigration and shipping. That one will take you to all the resources we have about immigration and shipping. Again, if you just wanted the indexes, you would go to Online Indexes I for immigration. So you see that we have the immigration guide, and just below that you'll see assisted immigrants digital shipping lists. So these are the digitized copies of the microfilm copies of the immigration agents lists. They were chosen as part of a pilot project because they cover a relatively long period of time, 1838 to 1896, and we'll look at an example of one of these and how you would navigate to them from an index entry. Like the convict guide, the shipping guide is also available online to browse through. And then a quick look at the table of contents. You can see they're all grouped: arrivals and departures of vessels, free passengers arriving, passengers departing, and then the crew records. So looking at the indexes that we have for the assisted immigrants, records really start about 1828. So the first index really to look at in that time period is the index to bounty immigrants from 1828 to 42. That's on microfilm in our reading room, and it's also available on the Family Search website. The main index on our website is Assisted Immigrants 1839 to 1896, and that includes the Newcastle, Moreton Bay and Port Phillip immigrants. Then there's a crew and passenger index, 1828 to 1841, and this was actually developed from the Joan Rees index for that time period. Then we have index to letters re-immigration, and these are letters sent by the immigration agent in response to complaints and other issues going on with immigration. Then there's a miscellaneous immigrant index, 1828 to 43. And I'll just say, don't forget the Passkeys Immigration Deposit Journals, 1853 to 1900. That's on microfiche in our reading room. It's essentially an accounting record. It records the name of the person who put the deposit down to sponsor the immigrant's name, their address in England or Ireland, wherever they're coming from, and also the vessel they arrived on. In some cases, if an immigrant didn't come out, it'll also show that the deposit was refunded. Now, as with the convict records, our assisted passenger lists are indexed and digitised onto Ancestry from 1828 to 1896. So looking at the indexes, we went to indexes, I for immigration, listing all the indexes. So the assisted immigrant index, 1839 to 1896. So the red button, search the index, but I just wanted to point out more about the index option here. So that'll take you to a page that tells you how the index was compiled, what record series are in that index, and also abbreviations and what they stand for. So that can be useful to help you interpret the records. Going back to the index, we're going to look at James Brown. So this index entry tells you the name, the age, the ship, the year of arrival, and the place of arrival. Also the two microfilm. So that first microfilm there we see for James Brown, reel 2139, is the agent's immigrant list. So that's one we can look at online. And then that second reel there, 2483, is the board's list, which will provide a little bit more information than the agent's list. So we'll see how that works. So to get to the digital immigration agent list, if we go back to the guides, just under there, assisted immigrant list, click on that. Now they're arranged by year and then chronologically within that year according to the date of arrival. So the Himalaya is arriving on the 3rd of March, 1865. So if I was to click on that link, now this will take me to the digital list. Now this is much like microfilm. If you've ever looked at them, you will have to go through the pages to find your entry. It won't take you directly to the entry for James Brown. So they're usually family groupings, single men or single females. Sometimes that can be vice versa. And then they'll be alphabetical within those groupings. So we can see that James Brown has arrived with his family, his wife Elizabeth, and then his children. So if you look at the last little child, Thomas, and if you look across, little Thomas was actually born on the voyage out here. So on this list, you get their age, their calling, so James is a minor, their native place and county, their religion, and whether they could read or write. Now, if we look at the board's list, a little bit more additional information will be given. So again, we get their age, their calling, their native place, but what we also get here is their parent's name, which can be very handy. Then religion, read or write. Next column is relations in the colony. So we can see that James has a brother and sister-in-law, William and Mary Clements, who are currently living in the Walls End Colliery in Newcastle. Then the next column has about their health, state of bodily health, their strength, and probable usefulness. Because remember, the government, they wanted to be able to, that the immigrants could work out here and support themselves. Fortunately for James, it's all good. The column next to that is any complaints reporting treatment on board a ship. So gratuities to the matron, the surgeon, the captain were based on whether there were any complaints about the immigrants' treatment on the voyage and if a report had to be generated from that. So these reports can be found in the Colonial Secretary's papers, and we also hold a separate series of reports, and they can be a bit of an interesting read. And you might have noticed in our list of indexes, there's an index to letters sent by the immigration agent in response to complaints and other matters. And so the index is uses the names of the individuals that are found in the letters. So that would be a way to have a little look at those if you wanted to see if an immigrant made a complaint on about a particular voyage coming out here. You might notice just above James's name in green writing is the word remittance. So this is a clue to have a look at the immigration deposit journals. So I did check the index to the immigration deposit journals and I did locate an entry for James Brown. So if you look at that, it seems that Mary Clement, his sister, has put down the deposit to sponsor James and his family passage to New South Wales. So we get James's name, his trade and calling, but we also get where they are living in England. So prior to coming to New South Wales, James and his family were living at the Rye Hope Colliery in the county of Durham. And then, of course, you have the character reference from a person who knows them, and then the amount applied for their passage, which in this case was £21 for the family to come out. And then in the end column, you can see that it lists the vessel of arrival for those people who have been sponsored. So that's just an example of 3 different records for the arrival of the Brown family, each giving bits of different information and each adding a little bit more to their story out here. Now having a look at unassisted passengers. The unassisted passenger records, as I've mentioned, provide very limited information, and particularly before 1854, many unassisted passengers were not listed individually on a passenger list, particularly those passengers who came out as steerage. Now, there are very few lists surviving before 1826. You could check our shipping guide for details of the surviving lists between 1788 and 1826. Newspapers for the time could be helpful because they often reported a ship's arrival, and these may contain a list of passengers. As always, Colonial Secretary is well worth checking. The 2 main series that we hold are the reports of vessels arrived from 1826 to 1859 and the series Passengers Arriving 1854 to 1922. So looking at the indexes that we do have, there's a very early one, miscellaneous shipping, 1792 to 1825, and that's available in our reading room. Then there's a miscellaneous index, 28 to 43. The unassisted immigrant, the Passkeys Index, unassisted immigrants, 1842 to 55 is worth checking. And then the website Mariners and Ships in Australian Waters has transcribed the shipping lists, and that's a free website to look at. Of course, the 2 indexes to the Colonial Secretary's papers, and there was a index, crew and passengers, 1828 to 1841, that was actually extracted from the Joan Rees Index. And as with the convict and the assisted immigrants, the unassisted passenger lists have also been indexed and digitised onto Ancestry from 1826 to 1922. Now, this is really the first time that these unassisted passenger lists have been indexed. Prior to that, and some of you might remember this, if you were looking for an unassisted passenger, you would have to go through the reels year by year, month by month. It was very, very time consuming. So to have this index has really opened these records up to researchers. So looking for free arrivals in the Colonial Secretaries Index, just looking at the first one here. Now I used the search term came free. So you can see the types of results I'm getting there. We can see Matthew Gibbons recommended as a free settler. Now that they are noted as free settlers would have to be noted in that correspondence. So he may say, I came as a free settler, and that's how it came to be recorded as came free in that index. Now from these, if you wanted to, again, you could go to the digitized image on our website. Looking at the later index, again, I used the search term came free, and you can see there are a lot listed there. So I'm going to look at the entry for Mary Atchison, so just got came free. The letter is 27/9431, so the letter has been written in 1827. Looking at that letter. So this is the humble petition of Mary Atchison, that the petitioner arrived in the colony free with her late husband Elias Atchison, Sergeant of the 37th Buff Regiment of Foot, in the month of March 1822, and her husband has died on the 4th of January 1827. So in the month of June of the present year, she was awarded a liquor licence, and the rest of the petition goes on to say that she's been very much inconvenienced from not being able to engage with a free man to be a house servant, and she is asking, can she have a servant assigned to her to help her with her business? So what we get out of this is we get the month and year that Mary arrived and how she arrived. So she's arrived as a wife of a member of the military. Now, to get more information about that arrival, you could look at when that regiment arrived, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later in this webinar to show you how you might find information of how that regiment came to be in New South Wales. So the ColSec can say when a person arrived as a free person into New South Wales, so very worthwhile checking. Now looking at the two main series we had, the first one being Reports to Vessels Arrived, 1826 to 1859. Now these have very limited information, a bit of information about the vessel itself. Passengers are usually just listed by Mr. and Mrs. And there is a health officer's report attached to these, just noting the ports that it stopped at on the way, what the cargo was, and if there was any illness or sickness on the voyage out. So an example of this is the Medway arriving in January of 1848. So you can see up the top, you get the details about the vessels, then the passengers. So the cabin passengers, we get their name. Again, it's Mr. and there's an initial and their surname. Looking down the bottom though, you'll see steerage passengers. So here we have 11 men, 7 women, 3 boys and 2 girls, just by number. Unfortunately, no names for the steerage passengers. Then the health officer's report saying general cargo, the number of the passengers, cabin and steerage. And just down there, it appears that dysentery had been on board immediately after leaving England, but fortunately, there's no indication that anybody died as a result of that on the voyage out. So the health officer's report was given to the health officer when the vessel landed, usually handed over by the captain or the surgeon. Now for the next series, which is Passengers Arriving, 1854 to 1922, we'll look at an example on the mariners and ships in Australian waters. So this was put together by Marianne Water and volunteers. So a wonderful project for them to do. It actually goes from 1845 to 1922, so a little bit earlier than the Passengers Arriving series. It provides a transcription of the shipping list and a link to the digital copy of the shipping list. On the right-hand side, you can see how it can be searched, browsed by year and month, vessel by vessel, or mariners and passengers. So looking at how the page might look, so you have here, this is looking by years and months. So you have the years and the months. So what we're going to have a look at is the Duchess of Edinburgh that arrived on the 31st of August in 1822. So I would have gone to 1822, August, and then scroll down to that date. So you click on the link there, and that will take you to the transcribed shipping list. So as you can see, the crew are listed first, and then we get the passengers. Now, this is actually a very good unassisted passenger list because it actually gives first name and surname, not only for the saloon passengers, but for the steerage passengers, and we also get the occupation. So you would be feeling pretty happy if your person you were looking for was on this vessel with all those details. Now, to look at the digital version, just down the bottom where that red arrow is, just across from that, you'll see a red scan button. You would click on that, and then that would take you to the digitized copy of the original passenger list there. So as you can see, not a lot of information, although the example I showed you does have a little bit more information than you'd normally get. Again, these have been indexed and digitized on Ancestry, as I said. So just looking here, you can see that we've got the unassisted passengers on Ancestry and the assisted passengers on Ancestry as well. Now looking at naturalization records. So naturalization records are a good way to perhaps find the arrival of people who were born outside the British Empire. So those people born outside the British Empire, if they wanted to vote or own land in New South Wales, they had to apply to become naturalised. One of the conditions of this is they had to have a 5-year residency in New South Wales before applying for their naturalisation. Now, we've got the records from 1834 up to 1903. After 1903, the naturalisation records are held by the National Archives of Australia. The good news is we have an index to the naturalisation records. So it also suggests you have a look at the guide in the A to Z guides. So our index does go from 1834 to 1903 and includes those records. These have also been indexed and digitised on Ancestry. The applications can be found in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence. So again, the Joan Rees Index to the Colonial Secretary's correspondence 1826 to 1896 would be the place to look for that. So looking at a naturalisation record, so the index, we're going to have a look at John Manuel. So the index will give you the native place. So he's from Portugal, the date of the certificate, which was the 4th of December, 1856, the original location, the page number, but also the real number if you were going to come into our reading room and look at the microfilm. So the naturalisation certificate looks a little bit like this. So, one thing I should point out about naturalisation records, you have to keep in mind that the information may not be entirely correct. A person's recollection of when they arrived or the name of the vessel they arrived on, and also language barriers. Many of them may have not been able to speak English or had very little English at all. So if they're providing that information to the clerk writing it down, details could get lost in translation. So that's just something to keep in mind. And we've got an example of this in John Manuel's record. So the record shows his name and that he's a native of the Kingdom of Portugal. He's 28 years old, and he states that he came out on the ship Lagrange in 1846. On checking the index to vessels arrived, the Lagrange did not arrive in 1846. It actually arrived in 1847. Now, that's just a little minor difference, which wouldn't be too hard to sort out, but it is something to keep in mind that if you do go to look for a ship that's named on a naturalisation certificate and your person's not on it, that it could be the reason that that wasn't the correct information in the beginning. So now John is now residing in Watson's Bay, and he is desirous of pertaining land and settling in the colony and availing himself to all the privileges of a British subject. His application, we would find it in the Joan Rees Index, the Cole Sec paper, so we can see it there. We know that's the ship, and we know 1856, that's when he got his naturalisation certificate, so it's likely this might be his application. Now, this contains a lot of the same information, although there's a little bit of difference. He's a bit more specific about his native place. So on this, he states he's a native of the Western Islands belonging to the Kingdom of Portugal. He also states that he is a labourer. He does give the Lagrange arriving in 1846 again, and he states he has been a resident here since that date with the exception of the occasional absence at sea. So that might indicate that he was a crew member during his time here as well. And just down the bottom, you can see is his signature. He has actually made his mark with an X, which would indicate that he wasn't able to write. So naturalization certificates, as I said, are a really good way of locating people who weren't born in the British Empire and their arrival out here. Now, if John was a crew member, we'll now look at how we might locate crew records. Again, the shipping guide, a very good source, the A to Z research crew, and the online indexes for crew. Having a look at the indexes we have, ship's musters 1816 to 1825. It's available on Microfiche in our reading room and also on the Society of Australian Genealogists website, and it has been indexed and digitised on Ancestry. And as we saw with the example of the passenger crew, the passenger list, crew lists are also on that series of passenger arriving 1854 to 1922, which has been indexed and digitised on Ancestry. You can also access these on the mariners and ships in Australian waters, as we saw. Once again, don't forget about the Colonial Secretary's papers. Both indexes are very worthwhile checking, and I did mention there is a separate index that has been taken from that Joan Rees index that covers the years 1828 to 1841. But just bear in mind, crew lists were not regularly kept until 1854. This is an example of a crew list. Now, no passengers came out on the voyage. This is the Memento arriving in 1873. So you can see it just lists the crew. We get their full name, their station, what their role was on the vessel, their age, and also from what nation they come. So that's quite a bit of useful information about crew members. Sometimes you get more about the crew member than you do about the passenger. So looking at other sources, we have quite a lot. We have a few records relating to crew that give quite good information. The registers of seamen discharged, which goes from 1859 to 1916. There is a published index going up to 1879, which is on CD in the reading room. Then the articles of crew, agreement of crews, which is a very good record, 1875 to 1922. And there are two separate series there, one covering Sydney and one covering Newcastle. Another good source is the particulars of certificates of competency and of service for masters, mates and engineers in the mercantile marine, and that's on COD in our reading room. And a good published source is Ship's Deserters, 1852 to 1900 by Jem Melton. Now, the information in this book has been taken from the Government Gazette up to 1862, and then the Police Gazette from there on up to 1900, when they become responsible for reporting those crew members who had deserted their ship. So looking at an example of an agreement of crew, now these were, crew would sign an agreement to work on a particular voyage. So this is the crew agreement for the Mavis in 1908. So the front page details about the ship and what type of voyage it will be doing. So the Mavis will be trading to and fro to any port in Australia or any island in the Pacific Ocean. The next page will give you the details about the crew. So name, age, nationality. There is a column for address, but not filled out on this one. The date of the name of their last vessel, which can be useful because then you could go to that vessel. Date and place of signing, in what capacity they were going to work on the ship, number of a certificate, so that would be a certificate of competency, and that then could take you to other records in our collection, particulars of discharge, when they left the vessel, and most importantly, what they were going to be paid. On this vessel, you can see we actually have a female crew member, just where my little red arrow is pointing there. So this is Ethel Sutherland. She's 20 years old. She's from Sydney. This is her first voyage, and she is going to be the stewardess on this ship. So this quite useful information on these crew records, and they're a lovely looking record to look at as well. Now, the COD, which is the particulars of certificate of competency, very easy record to check, as you can see, beautifully typed out, no difficulty with the handwriting, all alphabetical. So it gives the name of the holder of the certificate, the nature of the certificate, and you can see there are many different certificates there that they could get, the number of the certificate, the date it was issued, also place and date of birth, which is Very, very, very good information, as we all know. And that's in our reading room to check. What does the certificate of competency look like? Well, this is one for a mate of a coast trade steamship. This is Herbert Henry Williams, and this is in 1907. So we get his name, the certificate number, and it's number 5. We also get his address. So in 1907, Herbert Henry Williams is living in Darling Street, Balmain. We also get date and place of birth and his wonderful signature just there. Now, these are on microfilm in our reading book, but they have also been indexed and digitised on Ancestry. So this is looking at the information or records we hold that may help you locate military arrivals. The first thing to note is that records of military serving in New South Wales were kept by the British government and not by the state of New South Wales because they were the British Army. The British regiments were in New South Wales from 1788 to 1870, so that's quite a large period of time. So a lot of military personnel did come to New South Wales. However, most didn't remain in the colony. Most moved on when their regiment moved on. And generally, they're not mentioned by name on the shipping list. It'll just be the regiment. The main source to check are the British muster and pay lists. They're part of the Australian Joint Copying Project. They are in the State Library, but they've also been digitised on Trove. So for those former soldiers who settled in New South Wales, sometimes you can identify them or pick them up in various indexes such as the Colonial Secretary's correspondence and land grant records. The Passkeys Index to unassisted passengers, if you looked under R for regiment. Also, another good published source is R.H. Montagu's How to Trace Your Military Ancestors. Usually has a page for each regiment, when they came to New South Wales, where they went, where they were stationed. So that's a very good published source to look at. So if we were looking at how to find military arrivals in Colonial Secretary, we have our 2 fantastic indexes there. So you'd probably, if you knew the name of the soldier, look under the name, the regiment, or you could just regiment as a keyword, defence, military, or volunteer. The other index is the index to letters received by the Colonial Secretary relating to land, 1826 to 56. Many ex or former military personnel would write to the Colonial Secretary regarding land matters. And these letters can often state their regiment, which is very useful information because that can then take you back to the British muster and pay lists. So having a look at the index entries in the Joan Rees Index from 1826 to 1896. So I just used the keyword regiment, and you can see I got a lot of results, and that's just part of the results there. So again, that would have to have been mentioned in the correspondence that they were from a particular regiment, and that's why it shows up in the index. So we'll take a look at the entry for John Boardman, who arrived in 1870, and he's ex-48th Regiment. So in this petition, John Boardman is asking for his wife to be assigned for him. So he starts by saying the petitioner arrived in the colony in the year 1817 as a private in the 48th Regiment, now a pensioner after servitude of 21 years in the above named corps, and is at present a settler in the district of Maitland. After being married to Jane Brummer for 2 years, she was convicted through the misconduct of a servant in the petitioner's employ and sent to Moreton Bay for 7 years. That having expired 12 months ago, your petitioner finds that his wife has returned to Sydney and is now assigned to Mr. John Handley of the Horses Jockey Public House in Sussex Street, who the petitioner concurs would give her up to your petitioner if your Excellency would direct it to be done. Your petitioner's wife, having been living in Moreton Bay in the service of the commandment, and has been 8 months with Handley. Your petitioner trusts your Excellency will regard the prayer of this petition and direct his wife to be restored to his protection. Now, just down the bottom there, at the bottom of the letter is a character reference for him. The person is certifying that John Boardman has been known to him since the year 1808 and that he was always considered one of the most steady soldiers, and if what he states about his wife is true, she is suffering from the faults of others. So as well as getting personal details about his current living situation, we also get the details about his military service, what regiment he was in, how long he was in that regiment, and when that regiment arrived in New South Wales. and also somebody who's known him for many, many years, 1808. So a lot of good information in that you could go to other records with. And I'm happy to say that his petition was approved and his wife was assigned back to him. Now, Colonial Secretary's letters re land are a little bit different. They don't actually show if the person was in the military. So in this case, you may have to be looking for someone who you think was a soldier, and then check this index. So in this index, we'll look at the entry for Joseph James. So you can see the index shows the start date of the correspondence and the end date of the correspondence. So Joseph James's correspondence is between 1831 and 1839. We get the original location and the real number. As I said, these have been indexed and digitized on Ancestry, but you can look at them on microfilm in our reading room if you would like to. So taking a look at that letter. So this letter is written in 1839. And he's saying that the title deeds for his land situated at the Field of Mars granted to him as a discharged soldier from the New South Wales Royal Veterans Company became due in 1837. And he's requesting that the governor look at his case and enable him to take up his land. So from this correspondence, again, we learn what company he was part of, the New South Wales Royal Veterans Company. So with both of those, John Boardman and Joseph James, with the information about their regiment, you could go back to the muster and payrolls, and you could also look up the publication How to Trace Your Military Ancestors to find out a little bit more about those military regiments and companies there. So really in our collection for military arrivals, Colonial Secretaries is a very good source to look at. Now finally, but is departures, because some people did want to leave. So again, the Immigration and Shipping Guide on our website, the earliest departure list we have is dated 1794. Again, the ship's musters, because they are passengers and crew departing. Outward passenger lists were not regularly maintained until 1898, and in fact, our main set of records, outward passenger list, is from 1898 to 1922, so not a large period of time. The period 1898 to 1911 was on microfilm, so that has been indexed and digitized and available on Ancestry. So from 1912 up to 1922, it is the original record, and they are available to view in our reading room. Again, always worthwhile checking newspapers on Trove. After 1922, so from 1923 onwards, the National Archives hold Sydney outward departures, and they also hold lists of departures from Newcastle between 1865 and 1935. So just looking at an example of a departing passenger list. So this is for the Miltades, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Departing for London in 1921, going via the ports of Melbourne, Fremantle, Durban and Cape Town. So you can see here we have third-class passengers on board. Again, it's just their Mr. or Mrs. with the initial and then their surname, although it does indicate male or female, their age, whether married or single. Nationality is British, and also the port that they were going to disembark. So you can see that this particular group of passengers, they are all disembarking at different ports along the way of the journey. Then just one more to have a look at. So this is the outward passenger list for the Eastern. So this was just actually going from Sydney to Melbourne, so a coastal trip. Now, a little bit different in the information. These are first class saloon and second class saloon. Again, it's just Mr. A. Nichols, so the initial and the surname. However, we don't get anything regarding their age or whether they're married or single. But on this one, we do get their occupation, which can always be handy in trying to find more information about people, and their nationality, and they were all getting off at Melbourne. Well, that brings an end to the webinar. So I hope it has given you some tips and ideas about how you could trace arrivals into New South Wales. Thank you for listening.